Okay, so let us explore the definition of substance, which is our first branch. Right. So, in the words of Spinoza, we will have to remember this. Whatever I write in single quotes are extremely important and are a direct translation of the philosopher's own words. So, his definition of substance is in itself and conceived through itself. Here we can see the importance that he has given to the two parts of his definition, that is in itself. As we can see here, he is highlighting that the substance is nothing but an ultimate, we will have to remember these terms, ultimate metaphysical subject. Hope the viewers are aware of basic philosophical terms like metaphysical and subjectivity, objectivity, subject and object. So the first part of Spinoza's definition is that a substance is an ultimate metaphysical subject, or it is a whole, infinitely self-contained and self-determined, which are encapsulated by these two words, in itself. Next, we have conceived through itself. Next, we have Spinoza giving us a notion that substance is ontologically and conceptually independent So what he means by this is that to conceive or to know about this substance, which is the ultimate physical subject, there is no necessity of another subject to define our substance, because it is ontologically and conceptually independent, or it is from this we can deduce that Descartes is highlighting at the uniqueness of a substance, the indescribability of a substance, and the substance being treated as an axiom or undisputed truth. Therefore, existence of substance needs no substantiation. Now, let us look at these features. So, we have our definition and we have the two parts, the two broad parts, which is ultimate metaphysical subject and ontologically and conceptually independent. Now, ultimate metaphysical substance, by that Spinoza means that there is, let us imagine this to be our substance, just taking a spherical shape or something close to a spherical shape, which will aid in visualization. There is no such conditions for Spinoza's substance, geometric conditions anyway. So let us imagine this to be our substance S. Then we have an infinite number of parts of this whole, and what we mean by ultimate metaphysical subject is that all the other things that we see or our mind perceives is nothing but features of this substance or reflection of this substance. More into that later. So here we have parts of substance, here we have F1, F2 and F3. These are, or let us make it Fn. Here we have our features. So Spinoza tries to say that whatever the mind perceives like external reality and the um, worldly diversity that we come across is nothing but one of the features, one or more of the features, or a combination of features of this substance itself. So he is trying to make this substance as an ultimate metaphysical subject. Ultimate because it is the singularity from which everything evolves or modifies, and those are the features. So we have ultimate, we have metaphysical because we cannot know or we cannot perceive the substance in its entirety. It is beyond physics, hence we have metaphysical. Then we have it as a subject. So subject is something that exists and causes a few actions or with the aid of modification, transformation, sustenance, etc. Hence we have the three-word definition as ultimate metaphysical substance. Now we are coming to ontologically and conceptually independent, or the substance can only be known through the idea of itself and not through any external idea. Therefore we can imagine our substance here, and then we have something like a mirror which is indescribable. This is very similar to Shankara's philosophy. Just for example, I am employing this technique. In reality, there is no such mirror. There is no need for such mirror. Otherwise, it will be contradictory with Spinoza's philosophy, because to explain a substance, we need the aid of a mirror, but nothing like that. This is just a visualization tool. So a substance can only be known by itself. Just to highlight the term itself, I am using the reflection of our substance. So this is how we know our substance. Of course, in Spinoza's philosophy, the mirror too is part of the substance, or modified version or transformed version of the substance itself. So even considering that the reflection and mirror example, it does not violate Spinoza's philosophy, because the mirror itself is a modification of our main substance. And so typically we are knowing about our substance through the substance itself, though in its different form, but ultimately part of one whole. This is Spinoza's emphasis on monoism and his vision of unity. Hence, we have ontologically, conceptually independent, which is there is no need for any external agent or external substance to define our main substance. Substance is a single and unique, self-contained, self-determined, ultimate metaphysical subject. Now let us come to the second branch or conclusion. Conclusions about substance from our definition of substance. So here we have definition, and from the definition we draw a few conclusions. So here I will be using some mnemonics as well so that we can remember uh, some of the key terms of Spinoza's philosophy easily. Of course, after I give the mnemonics, I will also describe each word very briefly. So let us look at the conclusions through a mnemonic, which also happens to be the word substance. Not very surprising that I picked the word substance as the mnemonic itself. So our basic conclusions begin with, first I will all list them out, then I will describe them briefly. Okay, so this is our mnemonic, and these are some key terms with respect to conclusion of substance. First, we have the conclusion that substance is single, which directly follows from the word ultimate. We have explored why our substance of Spinoza is phrased with the term ultimate, and it only follows logically that he is hinting at one single supreme entity or subject, which is the substance. Hence, one of the features is that, one of the conclusion is that substance is a single ultimate metaphysical subject. And if it were more than two, it would be self-contradictory with Spinoza's philosophy and his doctrines, which we will explore further. Next, we have substance as unique and unlimited. So we have seen that through the second part of his definition, Spinoza gives the words ontologically and conceptually independent. So it can be conceived only through itself. Therefore, it is unique, and we will get to the term unlimited shortly. So once we define the term unique, it only follows that it is self-determined and self-contained, which means that there is no need for another entity to describe our substance, and it can only be conceived through itself. Therefore, this uniqueness and property of self-containment and determination prevents it from having any qualification. So this ultimately says that our substance is indescribable. So because if once we resort to the technique of description, it will limit our substance qualitatively. So once we say that our substance is uh, has features or qualities like 1, 2, 3, 4, it limits our substance to only these qualities. Therefore, uh, what we do is we describe our substance as through negatives, that is through neti neti, as we have seen in our Indian philosophy and Upanishads, and which logically implies eti eti. Neti neti literally translates to it is not this, it is not this, which is a negative way of describing, and which has logical implication of positive description. Therefore, when we have our indescribable substance, we use negative description, which implies logical description, to kind of define our substance. This makes it indescribable because employing the technique of description would limit its qualities to those terms which we use in the description. Of course, we cannot use infinite terms to describe, therefore, that is its limitation. Next, we have the term unlimited. Since it is unlimited, description cannot be employed, therefore, we go with our technique of negative annotation, negative kind of way of explaining things, by saying it is not this, it is not like this, it is not like this, and with every negative term we of course imply that it is something like this, which has infinite unlimited implications. Therefore, we go with this kind of technique. So we are done with the unlimited part. Then we have our substance, which is extremely similar to the Brahman in Shankara's philosophy, who has the same properties more or less. Single true entity, there is no other second entity, is the ultimate reality. Everything else is just a transformation of the Brahman, self-contained, self-determined, which makes him indescribable, and we have to resort to negative description method, logically implying positive description. Next, we have causa sui. This is the term that is used by Spinoza, where he means that the reality is self-explanatory, self-caused, and inclusive. So, to explain this, he uses the example, the geometric example of the triangle. Once we use the word triangle, we automatically mean a geometrical figure which has the sum of all three angles equal to 180. So we have angle A, angle B, and angle C, which is the summation is 180 degrees. This is the property that any type of triangle has to satisfy for it to be termed as a geometric figure called triangle. Hence, once we use the word triangle, it automatically implies that sum of all its angles are 180 degrees, and vice versa. Once we say that there is a geometrical figure with all of its sum of its angles as 180 degrees, then we mean that we are talking about a triangle. There is a slight distinction with respect to this, but that is not much needed here. Let us just take the principle of causa sui, which means self-implication, much like our Descartes' principle of cogito ergo sum, which is self-implication. Next, we have substance is eternal, and it follows from the very definition of a substance that it has to be eternal and not bound by time, because it is an ultimate metaphysical subject. So the principle of causa sui, of course, self-implication, was further analyzed and brought to the fore by uh, linguists, whom we call linguistic positivists, through their analysis of the synthetic and the analytic, the distinction between synthetic and analytic sentences, and so on. So this is something that can be kept in mind. So anyway, this is it is not of much use here, so we will skip that. It is just remotely related to the concepts of synthetic and analytic sentence, where there is self-implication and there is a need to describe. So that is the distinction. Next, we have the implications of our definition. There are some very important implications which we cannot ignore. Again, we have this from our definition. We have conclusion as well as implication. Of course, both of them are kind of related. So let us explore this part, or implications. The very first implication that we come across is theological implication. Often the beginners believe that Spinoza sticks to this concept of God, which is a very transcendental and metaphysical concept, not in line with reason or intellect, but not so. His theological implication, the theological implication of his definition of substance leads us to conclude that he is not talking about God as a creator. The popular definition or attribute of God that we see in religion or theism is that God is a creator, but not so. We do not have that kind of God in our philosophy of Spinoza. So God is not a creator. Next, there is no need for any transcendental entity. Therefore, we have some theological implications of Spinoza's substance, where he does not consider his substance or God as the creator God, or neither does he resort to any transcendental solution to define God. Therefore, these are his theological implications. Further, we shall see why it follows logically that Spinoza doesn't regard his substance as a transcendental entity. There is no need for explicitly mentioning this fact, but it only follows from his other implications, which I will talk about while summarizing. There we will get to know the meaning behind this phrase, not transcendental. Next, we have determinism as an implication of his philosophy. Again, we shall explore more when I summarize all his implications. For now, we can just have determinism explained by the phrase nature as an infinite necessary. So the term nature, the term infinite, the term necessary, all three will be dealt when I summarize all his implications. Third, we have some ontological implications. By ontological implications, we have our three basic properties, which is substance, deductive in nature, is the absolute infinity, and it necessarily exists. Of course, we have seen this through the second part of Spinoza's definition, which is ontologically and conceptually independent, which means it necessarily exists. It is an absolute infinity. We will explore infinity later, but not hard to guess where absolute came from. It came from ultimate metaphysical subject. So this is the part. Then it is deductive. This is directly a branch of our ontological substantiation, which means that it has to be deductive. The term deductive carries a few more implications, which implies that there is a cause, there is an effect, through which our substance becomes deductive, and by which our the philosophy of Spinoza becomes deterministic. They're all linked, and which is why I will summarize all of them in the end. I will just start with Spinoza's definitions and go on to enumerate or elucidate his conclusions and implications visually. So we can just know that the term deductive implies that there is a cause and effect principle through which it is deduced, and when there is a cause and effect principle, we have an element of determinism. Next, we have the fourth implication, as substance is all-inclusive whole. Not very surprising to guess where this came from. These came from the first part of the definition, which is ultimate metaphysical subject, and one of its conclusion was that it is unlimited, it is single, and it is, of course, unique. Therefore, the only way Spinoza can explain the diversity that we see in finite things of the world is by reconciliation of his first part of the definition of substance, by making it an all-inclusive whole. So this is attempt of reconciling the finite with the infinite through his explanation of the whole as a sum or aggregate of parts. We have some key terms: whole, we have parts, we have aggregate, we have reconciliation. Therefore, the only way there can be diversity when a philosopher accepts one ultimate, single, unique, unlimited metaphysical subject is through the approach of an all-inclusive whole. We'll explore that later when we see his doctrine of modes, but to be very brief at this point of time, what he means by all inclusive whole is that for Spinoza, his substance or God, through a very simple equation or equivalence relation to be specific, uh, his God is equivalent to nature. This is where he is unique, and this is where he becomes a pantheist and an impersonalist. This is where he uh, uh, rejects theology. This is where those theological implications take birth. So, this is a very important equivalence that has much significance. So, this is where he differs from the formal definition of God as a creator and necessity of any transcendental entity. This equivalence is God is equivalent to nature, is equivalent to everything that we see or perceive through the mind. So here when we are talking about rationalists, whenever I say perceive, it is only mental perception, not physical or sense related perception, because rationalists believe that the source of knowledge, if it has to be valid, then it has to only come through reason or mind or intellect. So perception is automatically mental perception. And here is where he beautifully ties it together. God is equivalent to nature, is equivalent to everything else, and which is ultimately equal to God. We can just draw an arrow here. So this equivalence holds paramount importance in the philosophy of Spinoza, and this basically gives rise to two of the most important philosophical implications, which is impersonalism and pantheism. To put it in layman terms, we have God is everything and everything is God. To those who are familiar with some sutras of Indian philosophy, this is nothing but ekam eva advitiyam. Ekameva dvitiyam. This is the Indian version of Spinoza's equivalence, which is to say that everything that we see or perceive basically is a form or modification or transformation of one single true entity, and there is nothing else except that one entity. Ekam eva advitiya. Now we are moving to the most interesting part, where we reconcile or we try to string together the definition, the conclusion, and the implication, our three branches. So I will define a system where all these three aspects are connected. I will begin with the definition, then build a system to draw conclusions, finally connect our implication with conclusions and definitions. Much like Spinoza's own geometrical method, where he starts with axioms, postulates, definitions, then move on to build a proposition with proofs. So his method is the best way to explain his philosophy. Okay, now we will start with the core or the heart of Spinoza's philosophy, which is, as we all know, God or substance. Now we have the other part, which is what Spinoza defines as system of modes. What is system of modes? Let us define system of modes right here. So in the words of Spinoza himself, he has two aspects. He broadly considers two aspects, of course, drawing an interrelation between them because he's a very strict monoist with a vision of unity. There is no scope for independent secondary entity in his philosophy. Hence, he uses two elements just to describe his philosophy and nothing more. Of course, he ties them together because everything has to tie into that ultimate metaphysical subject, which is God. Okay, we have God, substance, we have system of modes, we have the definition of God given by Spinoza as natura, naturans. We have system of modes defined by Spinoza as natura, naturata. So let us explore the direct meanings of both of them. Natura, naturans literally means nature, nurturing. Natura, naturata means nature, natured. Very interesting dichotomy here given by Spinoza, where he has one common element which is natura seen in both the definitions, and one variable element which is the second part, naturans and naturata, much like his definition, which was also two part in nature. Here we have to know the significance of both of them. So to explain them, we have a few terms. By natura, naturans, Spinoza believes in the active or productive form of God, the ultimate subject. By system of modes or natura, naturata, he means that it is the derivative, transformative, derivative or produced form. Of course, we can see some relation here. For anything to be produced, we should have a productive form. For anything to be a derivative, we should have an active cause. This makes his philosophy causal, believing in the cause and effect, strict, stringent cause and effect principle, and the strict stringency leads to determinism. Of course, there are some objections raised on this, which we will get to later while exploring the critical comments on Spinoza's philosophy. So here we see that both God and substance or system of modes, I mean God, which is substance, and system of modes, nothing but they're each other in different forms. This is highlighting their unity, and this is typically called as ontological unity. Very obvious why it's called ontological unity, because one is deduced from the other, one causes the other, one is a product of the other, one is a derivative of another. Therefore, something that has to do with the causal principle directly implies that we are hinting at the ontological aspect, which is why it is called as ontological unity between the two forms that Spinoza accepts, which is God as substance, one of the form of the ultimate substance, and system of modes, which is another form of the ultimate substance itself. Here, the process that happens for ontological unity is modification, modify, and very obvious that whenever there is the term modify, it implies that we have modes. We cannot escape modes. We cannot reconcile the two forms without the process of modification through the concept of modes, which is why Spinoza is constrained to propose something called the doctrine of modes. Doctrine of modes, one of the basic aspects of Spinoza's philosophy, which we will deal with later. Therefore, whenever there is a process of modification, we have modes and we have system of modes. Therefore, this directly implies another fact staring right at us, which we have to explore: the ontological unity, this process of modification, the two forms being tied together, all of them indicate at the what I would like to personally call reciprocal equivalence of Spinoza. Of course, we have seen his equivalence before and how important and significant it is throughout his philosophy. We will just write that equivalence down again in single letters. God equivalent to nature, equivalent to everything else, equivalent to God, his system. Reciprocal equivalence, it is only obvious from ontological unity and process of modification, reconciliation between two forms, that there has to be an equivalence between the two forms, and that is this primary equivalence that Spinoza accepts, which is God is equivalent to nature, is equivalent to everything else that we see, which is equivalent to God. So, in layman terms, God is everything, everything is God. Pantheism, impersonalism. Yes, now we have this basic equivalence from which we get impersonalism. This is how everything is tied together with respect to Spinoza's philosophy. They are not isolated terms. There is no need to by heart these terms as attributes or features or important keywords of Spinoza's philosophy, because one invariably leads to the other. If we know the flow, we know the entire set of keywords in the system of Spinoza's rational philosophy. Next, through impersonalism, we negate the effect of theology. There is no need of theology or the world of transcendence, because our substance, ultimate metaphysical subject, is impersonal in nature, infinite, ultimate, self-contained, transformative, two forms, reciprocally equivalent. Therefore, there is no need of a transcendental entity orchestrating the reconciliation that happens between the two forms. It is a self-evident, self-contained, self-determined process. We negate theology. Therefore, we accept that our substance is fully intelligent. There is no need for an external transcendental entity to orchestrate this entire process. Self-contained, causal, intelligent, fully intelligent. Therefore, there is no need whatsoever to accept a transcendental entity. Okay. Now, let us explore some uh, mathematics with respect to Spinoza's philosophy and the keywords that we have used, just some basic math to visualize or elucidate few key terms that we come across in Spinoza's philosophy, the first one being causal. We have the term causal because when we have the two forms, which is God and system of modes, and we invariably accept a unity between them and a modification, this modification implies that we are accepting causality. That is, the modification is orchestrated with every next moment determined by the previous moment and every previous moment leading to the next moment. This is nothing but the definition of causality. The mathematical definition: we have a system, we have x, we have the next moment x plus 1, we have the very next moment, so on, x plus n. Now we have event 1, event 2, event 3. Causality dictates that every previous moment x leads to the next moment x plus 1, ultimately leading to x plus n. This is the definition of causal, and the corollary implies that the system is deterministic, which is to say that event n, beg your pardon for writing 3, event n is from event n minus 1. Let's just take it to event 2, and event 2 is invariably from event 1. So we have a system, we have a causal system, and the corollary of this causality is, of course, determinism. No other variable involved. Every moment leads to the next, and every event is from the previous event. Therefore, deterministic system. We have our x plus n as very basic. Let us consider event n as equal to function of only summation of all previous events. Event n is a function of all previous events. E of I from I equal to 1 to n minus 1. That is the previous event, which when expanded is just simply E1 function of E2 function of En. This is our deterministic system in line with Spinoza's philosophy. Very basic representation. Next, we have a model for our equivalence that we saw, G equal to N equivalent to everything else equivalent to God. So again we have our ultimate substance God is equal to let us just use integral this time, because when we mean everything, we mean even the smallest part of the whole, a very small part of the whole. And when we divide our whole into extremely small parts dx, we can better explain the thing with integration. So let us just have two integrals. One is time integral, which explains the eternity of this relation. We have seen one of the conclusions that substance is eternal, substance relation therefore is eternal too. Between the two forms, it is always applicable. There is a permanent relation between our two forms. This permanent relation I am trying to highlight using our time integral, which is from 0 to infinity, beginning of time to the end of time, indicating permanent and eternal kind of relation. Next we have our other integral. So now we have our function, and of course this eternal function itself has an integral inside, which is to say that which is to highlight the equivalence basically. So this is our n integral from n to infinite. So by n, what we mean is, or to be more specific, by I, what we mean is there are infinite parts of the whole. So by everything we mean infinite parts, smallest parts of each and every part. Therefore we are going to describe the parts as an integral between I to infinity, where we have God, the ultimate substance in Spinoza, as a function of, we have G. Wow, okay, we have G I. So this further breaks down into f of G 1 to f of G what infinity, where we can just highlight by n equal to infinity, tending to infinity, whatever. And of course this is under our again the outer integral with time moving from 0 to infinity, which is to say that this relation is applicable forever, from the beginning of time to eternity, highlighting it's a permanent relation. So what I mean by function of God is that this explains the transformation, because God is the single entity who transforms from the active and productive to produced and deterministic. So every other substance which we perceive, or what we call as everything, is nothing but a transformed form of God himself. So we have, let's take an example of God equal to, we'll take some three substances. Let's say that there are only three substances that we can see. One is a tree, one is a bird, and one is, let's say, sky. Now, according to Spinoza, the philosophy is extremely simple. God is the only true single entity. These three things which actually comprise of God are nothing but his own forms. So there is tree, which is not an independent entity. What we perceive as tree is nothing but a form of God himself. This is the first form of God, or the tree as we define it. This is from our point of view. This is from the ultimate reality point of view. For us, we perceive it as the tree. We perceive one of God's forms as a tree. We perceive another God's forms as the bird. We perceive another God's form as the sky. But ultimately, it is nothing but just a form of God. Second form of God, and the third form of God in our system, in our hypothetical universe, there are only three forms, or three substances that we can see. Therefore, we have what we perceive as tree as one of the forms of God, another form of God, and finally our third form of God. God is nothing but, the whole is nothing but sum of the individual parts, or the absolute is nothing but sum of the individual forms, as we can put it. And this is our notion of the equivalence, mathematical notion of equivalence. So we can see that there is no other unnecessary variable involved in this, which means to say that there is no need for another independent entity, there is no need for another transcendental entity to explain the transformation between God and one of his forms. So this implicitly, it implies that everything that we perceive is just another form or modification of God, or to put it in simple terms, put in very simple terms, nature and everything are functions of God, implying they are modified parts of a whole. They are modified parts of a whole. So there is no need for an extra variable. The philosophical implication of this phrase is that there is no need to resort to theology, a creator God, or a transcendental world. There is absolutely no need. The system is self-contained and self-explanatory, self-determined, ultimate, single, unique, individual, causa sui, and eternal. This is how we reconcile Spinoza's philosophy with some very basic visual techniques and basic mathematical representations. Okay. Now we have the two very important doctrines of Spinoza. Doctrines of Spinoza. They are philosophical implications of Spinoza's definition of substance, and they are the tools that Spinoza uses to put forth his idea in a more concrete way, where he dives deep to explain the importance of monism and unity. The two doctrines of Spinoza, of course, they come with their own critical comments, and we shall explore all of them together. First, we'll explore the doctrines and the critical comments on each of the doctrine. So we have the first doctrine is doctrine of attributes. New term here, which is attributes. We shall explore what attribute means. Very simple term, quite obvious what attributes really mean and how they relate to our substance, and how many attributes constitute a substance. Like substance has how many attributes. So next we have doctrine of modes to explain our transformation between two forms, or the reconciliation between infinity and finite substances that we perceive, or explaining finite world through infinite whole, bridging the gap between infinity and finite substances, finite forms of substances. He had to resort to both these doctrines to make his philosophy very concrete and consistent. He is often praised as the most consistent rationalist, and the credit goes to both of these doctrines of his. Again, very mathematical in nature, and not it's very simple to visualize them. So now we have the first doctrine, doctrine of attributes. So what we will explore in the doctrine of attributes basically is first the purpose. What was the purpose for Spinoza to propose the doctrine of attributes? Is that to portray that essence of a substance as perceived by intellect. Of course, we'll dissect this seemingly complex sentence into simple parts. Let's use the technique of Descartes, where we divide our problem into simple parts and approach each of them to understand the whole. Just a reminder of Descartes' methods that we had studied before. So the purpose of the doctrine of attributes is to highlight the fact that attributes are essence of a substance as perceived by intellect. Very important terms: essence, perceived or perception, intellect. Whose intellect? What is intellect? And what is its role in perception of the essence? We shall all tie this together through a simple visualization. And one of the other aims of Spinoza in proposing his doctrine of attributes is to highlight that there are infinite attributes in number. With these two facts, he makes his definition of substance very consistent and concrete. We shall see how. So let us dive deep. So, very basic elucidation of Spinoza's doctrine of attributes. Spinoza accepts that there are infinite attributes. Basically, there are infinite attributes, but the human intellect can only perceive the two types of attributes. So there are actually infinite attributes. The limitation comes with our mind. Limitation is our intellect. Why so? We will explore later, but this is our limiting factor. If one asks Spinoza as to why the human intellect cannot perceive infinite attributes, the answer he gives is very simple. It is a limitation of human intellect, and what the human intellect or what a human is made of dictates what he perceives and to what extent he can perceive. This is very similar to our theory of dimensions, where typically we assume a flatlander, the very famous example of a flatlander who is an entity living in just two dimensions. He cannot perceive the third dimension. He can just perceive only two dimensions, which is just the x and the y axis. And suddenly you have a three-dimensional object like an apple falling into this universe of flatland, and our flatlander is completely taken aback. So he cannot perceive three dimensions, he can only perceive two dimensions at a time. So what he actually perceives is the apple part by part. So he only perceives one slice of the apple that is passing through his universe of two dimensions. So there we have one circle of the apple, then he perceives another one, then he perceives another one. So for him they are just a particular slice in motion, nothing else. He cannot perceive the 3D apple as we humans can perceive it. So that is what he means by limitation of intellect. He explores what the human is made of, because of which his perception is very, very limited. And this limitation causes humans to perceive these infinite attributes as only two types. Two types: extension, as he calls it, and thought. The exact two things, according to Spinoza, that are constituent of any human. So he proposes that all humans are nothing but a summation of extension and thought. So what we can ultimately perceive is limited by what we are made of, that is extension and thought. So we can only perceive two attributes, extension and thought, because we are made of the same. We live in this world of extension and thought. We are the human, or extension and thoughts are constituents of the humans, and they are the limiting factors to our perception of the substance. So we can only perceive substance through our reason, intellect, mind, etc. and they are limited by extension and thought. So that is the reason why I drew this line here. So we have our ultimate substance. In reality, uh, they have infinite attributes. There is no such dividing line, or we can say that there are infinite such dividing lines indicating infinite attributes. But from the view of human intellect, we have human intellect here, and human intellect point of view. Human intellect point of view, we have substance as a bundle of infinite extensions. Extension can be visualized as something similar to body, which whose basic quality is extension, and thought can be visualized as something similar to mind, reason, and intellect. It's not the extension is not one of its property, but reasoning and thinking is cogito is one of its property. Therefore, we have our ultimate substance. This is all from human intellect point of view, where he gives theory of doctrine of attributes. So we have infinite extensions, infinite thoughts, the two perceived types of attributes by humans for a substance, for the substance. Sorry, there is no a substance in Spinoza's philosophy. It is always the substance. It is the ultimate metaphysical subject, therefore the substance. And what Spinoza proposes here is very interesting. He um, draws a parallel between extensions and thoughts. So this ultimate substance, whose attributes are perceived by limited human intellect as infinite extension and infinite thought, are, let us just draw these parallelisms, what he calls as parallelisms. So basically, these three planks, what we can consider, has two sides, one facing you, one that you cannot perceive, that is the other side. It's like two sides of a coin. So one side is extension, one side is thought. So for every extension there is a corresponding thought. Therefore, we have E1 and T1 making up our first parallel pair. We have E2 and T2 making up our second parallel pair. We have En and Tn making our nth parallel pair. So these attributes, this is the process of perception by the observer or the human intellect. I'm just drawing an eye which represents the human intellect or observer, human intellect point of view, substance, the process of perception. This is the process of perception. Process of perception of substance through attributes. We can perceive the substance through attributes only, which is why attributes are, as we had defined before, essence of substance as perceived by intellect. They are the essence of a substance as we perceive them. Okay, now we have perceived, the process of perception is over. We have perceived two types of attributes through our limited intellect, that is extension and thought. Infinite extension, infinite thought, each infinite of its own kind. So they are not similar infinities, they are distinct infinities. Each infinity is of its own kind. It's the beauty of infinity. No one knows what infinity really is, and this is the sentence that highlights that point. Like, each infinity is of its own kind. And as I said, humans can only perceive two attributes, extension and thought, mostly because we are, as defined by Spinoza, humans, or us, we are embodied spirit. Embodied spirit. Fitting description to highlight what we are made of. Embodied which typically means that we have an extended portion or an extended part, spirit, which means that we have the part of thought. So we are nothing but um, our thoughts put in an extending body. We are nothing but our own thoughts and reason and intellect put inside an ever extending body. So, since humans are embodied spirit, or since humans are constitute of extension and thought, our intellect also can only perceive these two dimensions, much like our flatlander, which is extension and thought. Though there are infinite attributes or infinite dimensions to our substance, our perception is limited to two dimensions, extension and thought. And the the metaphors that Spinoza gives to highlight the relation between extension and thought are, he says that they are like two sides of a coin. They are like parallel rays of the sun. Two sides of a coin, parallel rays of the sun, and he also tells that they are like a convex concave lens. Very interesting definition here. What he means ultimately by that is that we have lens L1, we have lens L2. So there is one single substance with infinite attributes, then we have our perception here, then we have bundle of extensions with their corresponding thoughts, extension, thought, extension, thought, extension, thought. Then we have them converging at lens 2, ultimately resulting in substance. This is how he reconciles the doctrine of attributes. Substance, perception, and substance. Yes, some of the key phrases in these elucidation of his reconciliation between extension and thought are they are same. They are same. He says that they are same, they are inseparable. He says they run parallel, and for every extension there is corresponding, there exists a corresponding thought. Beg your pardon, I forgot the mathematical symbol for there exists. Therefore, for every extension there exists a corresponding thought. Key aspects of the doctrine of attributes. Very interesting part of our course here is to discuss the critic or critical comments on Spinoza's doctrine of attributes. Critical comments on doctrine of attributes. So we will divide this whole exercise of analyzing critical comments, making sense out of them, into 5 parts. So we have 5 criticisms, and we have we'll use 5 tools to make sense and analyze the meaning or essence of the criticism. So the 5 tools are attack. On what aspect? Next we have attack by. Sometimes it will be directly mentioned that the attack is by so and so philosopher, but most of the times it won't be explicitly mentioned, though, so we have to draw some conclusions and maybe make a guess as to which philosopher or what stream of philosophers are more likely to attack this proposition by Spinoza. So next dimension we have problem. What is the problem that the attacker highlights? Then what reason does he give to substantiate that what he sees in Spinoza's philosophy is a problem? Why is it a problem? We can't just make claims that there is a problem with Spinoza's philosophy. We need some reasoning behind that. So the next dimension is reason. Finally, we have inference. Inference is basically ties up the problem and reason and gives what the problem is, the reason behind our problem in just a few words or in just one or two sentences. So this is our inference, and these are our 5 dimensions to analyze the critique of Spinoza's doctrine of attributes. Very first attack is there is attack on number of attributes. So the attack is on the topic number of attributes. Attack is probably by idealists, and the problem they highlight is that Spinoza considers two types, limits attributes to only two types, though he does it through the lens of perception, and it's a limitation for humans. But the idealists, they attack Spinoza for explaining infinite attributes through two types of perception. That is their point of attack, that's their problem. And the reason is their reason is that if there are infinite attributes, why, or they want to know the reason why perception is limited to just two. So their question is kind of simple. They say that we are going to attack the number of attributes part of your doctrine of attributes, and then we are idealists, probably we are idealists, and the problem is that the perception of two types. Their reason is, if there are infinite attributes, then why are we perceiving only two attributes? The inference they make is that since everything through that grand equivalence that we saw, since all is nothing but substance, or one of its forms, nothing but substance, one of the forms of substance, but it has the inherent nature of a substance, it has the attributes of a substance. So be it one of its form or be it the substance itself, since Spinoza accepts only one single true ultimate metaphysical entity, he accepts that everything that he perceives, like you, me, the tree, the bird, the river, everything is some or the other form of a substance, and the inherent essence of a substance is to have infinite attributes. So the attack is that we are some form of the substance, and ultimately, though we are limited by form, we inherently have infinite attributes. That is one of our properties, because we are nothing but substance by essence. So, and the essence of substance is having infinite attributes. So it is inherent in us. Infinite attributes are inherent in us. If you accept that infinite attributes are inherent in us and all of us are nothing but the essence of substance, why can't we perceive infinite attributes? Why can't we perceive infinite attributes? Why do we only perceive two types? When we are the essence of the substance itself, and the essence of substance is infinite attributes, why can't we perceive infinite attributes? So they are telling that we have the tool, we have the innate capability to perceive infinite attributes. Why our perception is limited to only two types? This is the attack by them. This is our first attack on doctrine of attributes. Our next attack is interesting. We have Spinoza accepting the indeterminate substance, indescribable substance, indeterminate substance. So The basic attack is on indeterminate substance, and the attack is probably by impersonalists, and the problem they have is with the indeterminate nature of substance. So Spinoza has defined indeterminate nature of substance, so they have their problem with that definition of Spinoza and how it does not gel together with doctrine of attributes. So their problem is indeterminate nature of substance, and they say that if the substance is indeterminate, then why do you need attributes? What is the use of attributes? We have seen that indeterminate is usually accompanied by negative description or niti, which logically implies a positive description. Once we restrict the substance to be indeterminate by nature, then we cannot associate the substance with attributes which will act as a descriptor or a limiting factor of the qualities of a substance. So this is not acceptable by the impersonalists, because they see that description of substance through attribute as limiting the qualities of our infinite substance. So by this, the impersonalists say that Spinoza is making his philosophy highly a priori. By a priori, it means highly probable or determinate, exactly opposite of indeterminate. He is making his philosophy highly determinate through using attributes. Having infinite attributes, as described by Spinoza, is logically implying that he is making it highly a priori or highly probable or highly determinate, and the very definition of indeterminate substance is lost. Next, we have the attack on mind and body. Probably we have this attack by all the three people: idealists, materialists, and probably another section, monoists too, because somewhere the monoists see that Spinoza is accepting some kind of duality here, which is not very popular among the monoists. So here we have some involvement, probable involvement of monoists as well. So the problem they have is parallelism. Parallelism between body and mind. So here, as we saw in the doctrine of attributes, Spinoza tells that every extension is followed by a thought, and both of them are parallel, and that is his doctrine of attributes. So their problem is with this parallelism, and their reason is very simple: matter can't explain mind, and vice versa. If there is a strict parallelism between the two and there is no reconciliation, both of them are treated as dualities, then how can one explain matter? Because matter is not related to mind if they are parallel. If mind and matter is parallel, then matter can't explain the mind can't explain the matter. So what explains mind and matter? That is the problem. And the inference is, it is neither fully ideal, or it is not complete idealism, nor is it complete materialism. It is neither complete idealism nor complete materialism. We have Spinoza accepting parallelism between mind and matter, because of which neither matter or mind can't be explained. he invites the wrath of the monoists as well in doing so. Next we have our last but one fourth critic, which is to say that substance is, Spinoza puts it that simply, substance is an aggregate. Substance is an, okay, let us consider the very general proposition. This is the attack on the relation between substance and attribute. The basic attack is on the substance attribute relation. Probably the attack is by dualists, and the problem they have is that Spinoza considers substance as simple aggregate of attributes and not an organized whole. Very important term here, organized. So Spinoza basically says that substance is simple aggregate of attributes and not an organized whole. So the problem these dualists have is that Spinoza can't explain true identity of substance. He cannot explain the true identity of substance without the aid of organization or organized whole. So what they mean by that is that you can't just consider substance as some random aggregate of different attributes and call it the ultimate entity, because substance is perfect, substance is ideal, substance is ultimate metaphysical subject. So it needs some organization as a whole, organization of the different parts to form an organized whole. Therefore, where is your explanation of organization? You have not done anything to explain self-organization. You have just considered it as random aggregate of attributes. So is the organization left to a separate entity? So this is why the dualists attack it. They believe that there is a separate entity that is orchestrating this organization, and actually it is not a self-contained system. Therefore there is another true independent entity that exists for the process of realizing organization. This is why probably this attack is by dualists, and their inference is that Spinoza's real aim to explain the one true entity is not fulfilled. Real aim is not satisfactorily fulfilled. Okay, now we have the last attack, simple attack on substance, the duality of substance, or perception of dual attributes of a substance, probably attacked by monists who hate dualism. And their attack is very simple. Spinoza accepts that substance is perceived as extension plus unextension or thought. Thought is nothing but unextension. Only two entities are there. We have seen this in the philosophy of Descartes' mind and body dualism, that the basic characteristic of the body is extension and characteristics of mind is thought, which is unextension. So according to Spinoza, he believes that substance is summation of extension plus unextension, though it is perceived to be so and not really. But still the monists have a problem, because they believe that a substance cannot be both. It simply cannot be both at the same time. Either it has to be a pure consciousness, which is, it is only an extension, not an extension, doesn't have a body, what we call as Nirakara and Nirguna in Indian philosophy. So our ultimate substance is something which does not have extension, nirakara, no form, formless matter, or only pure bliss, Satchidananda consciousness. And the inference that they draw is if he accepts both, then it invariably leads to duality. It invariably leads to duality. One cannot escape duality by accepting both extension and unextension as attributes of one single reality. That is not at all consistent. Therefore, the perfect and consistent monoists attack this. Okay, so now we are done with attacks, done with the critical comments. Now we move on to the last topic of part 1, doctrine of modes. Very simple part in Spinoza's philosophy. Doctrine of modes. The key that holds the secret to Spinoza's consistency in his philosophy, the doctrine of modes. Very brief visual description of the doctrine of modes. Let us get right into it. We have DOM, doctrine of modes. Right, so as usual, before moving into any doctrine, we will first see what is the purpose of proposing this doctrine. What is the purpose that Spinoza had? What is the constraint that Spinoza had that he had to propose the doctrine of modes? That constraint is to reconcile infinity and finite substances, or finite forms of substances. Let me just diagrammatically explain that part. So the purpose is that there is a problem, and to address that problem he had to propose the doctrine of modes, and that happens to be the purpose of his proposal. So the basic problem is that there is the human, there is the attributes, and we humans simply cannot perceive infinite attributes. There are infinite attributes, and humans are limited to finite perception. As we have seen, only two types of attributes you can perceive, that is extension and thought. So after facing all the critical comments for his doctrine of attributes, probably he would have envisioned this doctrine of modes immediately after doctrine of attributes before he got any criticism. But let us just visualize that Spinoza proposed the doctrine of attributes, then he hypothetically saw the critical comments that he was getting, and to reconcile or to satisfy the critics, he proposed the doctrine of modes. Let's just consider that as a story so that it sticks for a long time. So we have humans who can perceive finite attributes, two types, extension and thought, and we have attributes themselves which are infinite in nature. So the purpose of proposing the doctrine of modes is to bridge the gap. Let us draw a bridge itself so that the purpose, now we come to the actual purpose. Reconcile, explain finite with infinity, explain finite with infinity, reconcile infinite with finite, and all this through modes. Very, very simple concept. So this is his purpose, overall purpose as we see it. And to put it in very simple mathematical terms, let us use the limit, so as to speak. Limit of x tending to infinity and a function of x. This is how usually in mathematics we consider the behavior of a function at the limit of infinity. So we simply cannot imagine how the function behaves like at infinity. So what we do is we consider the limit of variable tending towards infinity in that function, and then based on the definition of that function we do some simplification and finally get the behavior of that function, what it actually reduces to at infinity, at the limit of infinity. We cannot make x equal to infinity. We cannot do this. So what we do is we make x tend towards infinity. We make it tend towards infinity. Probably this is what Spinoza is doing here. He's making x or finite element tend towards infinity to analyze the function or the behavior of how a finite form of the substance, or how one of the forms can be perceived at the junction of infinity. This is how he tries to reconcile. Mathematical example. And we are going to explore his whole theory of doctrine of modes through very basic scientific example that redefined and shook the edifice of modern physics. We will just explore that, and before which we are going to define the purpose of doctrine of mode in 3 words as Spinoza's vision of unity. This is nothing but a vision of unity that Spinoza proposes. And now we will deconstruct the entire doctrine of modes through a very famous example of quantum mechanics, the example that redefined our perception on matter itself. That is, as you might have guessed, the very famous Young's double slit experiment. I'm assuming some basic familiarity with the Young's double slit experiment and nature of matter, whether the whole debate that goes on about nature of particles, whether the nature of reality, as to say whether reality is made of particles, or are they waves, or are they matter waves. This whole dichotomy between matter and waves, particles and waves, and so on. So we will try to explore Young's double slit experiment in light with Spinoza's doctrine of modes. They're very, very similar to each other, and the explanation, at least in my opinion, will seem to be satisfying and consistent in explaining the doctrine of modes. Let us have a basic setup for Young's double slit experiment, which is a wave and passing through 2 slits, which is why it's called the double slit experiment. Here we have our 2 slits, S1 and S2. Here we have our wave or electron or whatever you want to call it. And as soon as the wave passes through the slits, we see what we observe at our screen here. So as to say, what we call as the observation screen, what we observe here is almost immediately we find an interference pattern, as it is called in physics. Interference pattern is nothing but alternate dark and light shapes. So here we have a dark mode. Let us use the word mode because we are talking about doctrine of modes. Here we have the light mode. So we have light mode. So it's very consistent with what Spinoza had envisioned, and according to our Young's double slit experiment, we have an electron passing through 2 slits, acting each as a generator, and the process that goes on here is the process of construction and destruction of waves. That is the interference between the 2 wavelets, as they call it, and finally leading to an interference pattern on the screen, almost shocking everyone that performed this experiment and verified it through repetition. So the shocking factor is that if one of the slits is closed and we do it as an experiment of superposition. Say, first we pass through slit 1 and by closing slit 2, and then we close slit 2 and pass through, we close slit 1 and pass through slit 2. If we do the experiment individually and then add the results of the two parts, then we do not observe this interference pattern. Instead, we observe a pattern that we expect often, that is one region here and one separate region here, that is directly corresponding with the slits. So that is what happens when we throw a ball, for example, through the slit. So everywhere where there is no slit, the ball rebounds, and only when it passes through the slit, it hits the screen, and so on. But this interference pattern, equal distribution, is mind-blowing. Anyway, and as a function, what we see is that the interference pattern has varying intensity with maximum intensity at the center. This is like a varying intensity, different shades of the color, if you want to call it by that nomenclature. So we have dark and light, but this represents different shade of dark, this represents a different shade of dark, this represents a different shade of dark, and so on. So this is like, we can call it as a shade. This is one property of the interference pattern. And the colors itself, there are only just two colors or two modes, which is dark and light. Now, how do we tie this together with Spinoza's doctrine of modes? Now let us start labeling our whole setup with Spinoza's doctrine of modes nomenclature. So this original electron or wave, whatever you want to call it, is Spinoza's substance. This is Spinoza. This is nothing but Spinoza's substance with infinite attributes. This is the substance with infinite attributes. And the screen, what we see here with the two slits, is we can call it as the human embodied spirit, as Spinoza himself has defined. There is no need for us to do anything new here. So this is the human embodied spirit, the whole two slits that we have designed for our experiment. This defines, this is us. This is us with our two constituents, which is extension and thought. So we have human embodied spirit. In the terms of doctrine of modes, it is formally called as another. It is another through which, what this another is not defined exactly, and this thing is another through which substance is conceived. Substance is conceived. So human embodied spirit, or the double split, is another through which substance is conceived. This is how, using this, we conceive the substance on the screen. This is the infinite substance. This is the pattern that we are observing on the screen. This is the another through which the substance is conceived. This is helping us to perceive this substance. And finally, what is this dark mode and light mode? Very easy to guess. They are the two modes that Spinoza expounds, that extension. One is extension, whichever you want, you can just dark to extension, light to thought, or vice versa. It doesn't really matter. So here we have extension, here we have thought. Very analogous to dark mode and light mode that we observe on the screen here, the interference pattern that we observe. And of course, it is only logical to say that the interference pattern that we observe are our modes. They are our modes. They are finite. And in the language of Spinoza, they are individual, finite experience. individual finite experience. By experience, of course, he means rational mental experience, intellectual experience, not sensual experience, of course, because he's a rationalist, very strict rationalist, most consistent rationalist. So what the pattern that we observe here, the interference pattern on the screen, they are analogous to modes of Spinoza. They are finite. So we have our substance which is infinite. The infinite attributes of a substance then passes through the embodied spirit or another through which substance is conceived, finally to bring about this beautiful pattern which is finite. Here we have a finite pattern with two modes, finite because it just has two modes. Now, how does he reconcile this finite modes with the substance again? Because does it imply that the other attributes of the substance are somehow diminished or taken away? Definitely not, because here we see there is an interference pattern with varying intensity, what I call a shade. Now let me rephrase it as intensity. Here we have dark mode, light mode. Here we have intensity as probably another kind of, I won't say mode, but another kind of entity here, or intensity. So once you combine intensity with dark and light, once you combine this, we get various modes. We get infinite modes. Or to say, we reconciled our finite modes with infinite attributes of substance at the end. So intensity, dark, we have dark mode, we have light mode. We have various intensities in dark mode, we have various intensities in light mode. So let us just quantify intensity like saying that uh, 1 or 1 or 2 times the intensity, 3 times the intensity. So 2 times as dark as the previous one, 3 times as dark as the previous fringe, and 2 times as light as that, 3 times as light as that. So when we combine these 3, we get various types of modes, that is converting our finite back to infinite, realizing the infinite. So probably this is one of the analogies that I found to be interesting and in line with Spinoza's theory. This is basically his doctrine of modes.